14 months. That is how long they had been watching a number that should not exist. Not a person, not a place, not a name on a watch list. A number. Specifically, the number 0. Entered in a federal database column labeled clerical corrections for 14 consecutive months, without interruption, without variance, without the one thing that number is statistically guaranteed to have across any living database maintained by human hands. One mistake. Just one. That column had averaged 40 amendments per quarter for the 3 years before those 14 months began. Every database breathes. Entries get corrected, timestamps adjusted, roster fields updated when sailors transfer, when schedules shift, when human error creeps in. 40 corrections per quarter is not sloppiness. It is proof of a living system. 0 corrections for 14 months is not efficiency. It is concealment. Somewhere inside a naval logistics command, a records clerk had stopped making mistakes, or rather, had stopped leaving any behind. What that clerk had been doing instead, in the quiet hours before dawn, in the gap between the last authorized login and the first morning shift, is the reason 11 people would eventually face federal indictment. 3 laptops and 2 servers would be seized from 4 separate locations, and a GRU intelligence network would be dismantled from inside a government records office no one had ever considered a target. This is the story of how they found him. It did not begin with a tip. No defector, no walk-in at the embassy, no burned asset passing a name through a cutout in a neutral city. It began with an auditor. A single internal auditor conducting a routine data integrity review. The kind that generates 300 pages of output that nobody reads. The kind that gets filed inside a shared drive that someone names something like Q3 Compliance Archive and never opens again. This one got read. The auditor was not looking for espionage. She was looking for a filing error. The Naval Logistics Command had recently migrated its personnel management database to a new platform, and the migration team needed confirmation that historical amendment records had transferred cleanly. Standard procedure. The auditor pulled the amendment logs going back 3 years, loaded them into a spreadsheet, and began scanning column by column. The first 2 years looked normal. 41 corrections in Q1, 38 in Q2, 44 in Q3. The numbers breathed the way numbers in a healthy system breathe. Then she reached the 14-month stretch. 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. She sat with that for a moment. She pulled the raw database records herself, bypassing the summary layer, checking whether the zeros were genuine entries or a migration artifact. They were not artifacts. The database showed real read activity throughout those 14 months. Records being accessed, cross-referenced, exported. They simply were not being corrected. Not once. She wrote a 3-line note in the margin of her review document. She forwarded it to her supervisor. Her supervisor escalated it. Within 72 hours, that 3-line note was sitting on a desk inside the FBI's Counterintelligence division. That is what the beginning of Operation Pale Ledger looked like. Not a dramatic intercept. Not a blown cover. 3 lines of text from an auditor who noticed that a number had gone still, and understood that stillness like that does not happen by accident. The field office that caught the referral assigned a small analytical team first. 2 counterintelligence analysts and a forensic data examiner, before a single agent stepped near the logistics command. The rule in counterintelligence is that you do not alert your subject. You watch. You build the frame around them so completely that when you finally move, there is nowhere left to go. The analysts began with the access logs. Every login to the personnel database was time-stamped, and every terminal had an assigned user credential. They pulled 14 months of login records for the terminal flagged in the auditor's note. The terminal where 0 corrections had originated, or more precisely, had failed to originate. What they found was a pattern within a pattern. The terminal showed normal activity during business hours, routine lookups, roster queries, standard administrative functions consistent with a records clerk role. Nothing that would have drawn a second glance from any automated monitoring system. But buried in the after-hours log, on 41 separate nights across the 14-month window, the same terminal had generated read access spikes. Not writes. Not corrections. Reads. Bulk reads. Large record sets pulled in sequence, crew manifests, berthing assignments, rotation schedules, personnel transfer orders covering vessels across 3 operational commands. Every one of those access spikes occurred at 3:40 a.m., not 3:38, not 3:42. 3:40 on the dot, give or take 90 seconds, 41 times across 14 months. The analysts ran the statistical probability of that clustering occurring by chance. The number they came back with was not a number anyone needed to debate. A human being had set a clock. The forensic examiner cross-referenced the 3:40 a.m. access events against the records clerk's official badge access log for the facility. On every one of those 41 nights, the clerk's badge had been swiped at the building entrance between 3:28 and 3:35 a.m., always within a 15-minute window before the access spike, always departing before 4:15 a.m. On none of those nights was any overtime logged. No supervisor had authorized after-hours access. The clerk had been entering the facility on personal initiative, in the dead of night, to pull records no one had asked for. The FBI opened a full counterintelligence investigation. Operation Pale LEDER was active as of March 14, 2024. The first real obstacle was the most fundamental one in any insider threat case. You cannot simply arrest a government employee because their login timestamp is suspicious. You need to know what left the building. And to know that, you need to see the transfer. I spent time going through the investigative sequence in this case, and one detail kept pulling at me. The gap between when the FBI knew something was wrong and when they had any idea how the data was actually moving. Those first 6 weeks of Operation Pale LEDER produced a picture of suspicious behavior with no visible mechanism. The clerk's terminal was air-gapped from any external network by standard protocol. There was no USB transfer in the logs, no email attachment, no direct upload. The records were being pulled. And then, as far as the base's own monitoring infrastructure was concerned, they were simply sitting there. They were not sitting there. The forensic team requested a covert analysis of the clerk's workstation, the kind that requires coordination with the facility's security officer, conducted between shifts, leaving no trace. What they found on the drive was a folder structure that appeared to be a payroll backup archive. Nested inside the folder was a cloud synchronization token, a credential key for a commercial cloud storage account registered to a name that did not match the clerk's personnel file. The token was configured to auto-sync the contents of a specific subfolder every time the workstation established a network connection, which it did, automatically, every morning when the facility's system came online at 5 a.m. The clerk was pulling records at 3:40 a.m., staging them in the subfolder, and letting the building's own network carry them out at dawn. Dead drop by cloud. The tradecraft was not sophisticated. It did not need to be. It had worked for 14 months without a single flag. The FBI subpoenaed the cloud account under a sealed order. What they found inside was 8 encrypted archive files, each timestamped within hours of one of the 3:40 a.m. access events. The files were encrypted with a key the clerk did not hold on the workstation, meaning someone else had the decryption capability, someone who was downloading from the other end. The FBI needed that other end. The National Security Agency's Counterintelligence Support Unit was brought in to trace the download pattern from the cloud account. NSA CI does not comment on its methods, but the technical picture that emerged over the following weeks was this. The cloud files were being accessed from 3 separate IP addresses, each routed through layered anonymization infrastructure, each download occurring within 48 hours of each upload. The timing was too precise to be automated. A human being was watching for the uploads and retrieving them. One of the 3 download addresses resolved, through a chain of infrastructure analysis, to a network segment associated with a commercial communications provider operating out of a third country. The kind of provider whose services are specifically marketed to clients who need clean network architecture. The kind of clients who include foreign intelligence services. NCIS, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, joined Operation Pale LEDER in the 5th week. 2 agencies, 14 analysts, 1 records clerk who had just passed a routine background reinvestigation 9 months earlier with no flags. Here's the take that will probably get us pushback. The background reinvestigation process, as it currently functions, is not designed to catch what Pale LEDER was. A background review looks backward at financial records, personal associations, foreign contacts declared on forms. It does not look at what a person does at 3:40 in the morning in a building they are not required to be in. It does not analyze database access patterns over time. It does not ask whether a cloud sync token on a government-adjacent workstation belongs to an account registered under an unfamiliar name. The system passed this clerk because the clerk had done nothing the system was built to detect. That is not a flaw in the process. It is a flaw in the assumption that the process is sufficient. And right now, somewhere in this country, there are cleared personnel who passed their last review cleanly, and who were already compromised when they walked into the reinvestigation room. The FBI applied for a Title III wiretap order covering the clerk's personal devices and residence in the 6th week of the operation. The application ran 47 pages. A federal judge signed it. What the wiretap revealed in its first 3 weeks was mostly silence. The clerk's communications were disciplined. Minimal digital footprint, careful separation between personal and professional devices, social behavior entirely consistent with someone who understood that unusual patterns attract attention. The handler. Whoever held the other end of that cloud account was not calling, was not texting, was not meeting in person in any observable way. The operation hit its first serious wall at the 8-week mark. The download activity from the cloud account stopped, not slowed, stopped. The 3 IP addresses that had been accessing the files went dark simultaneously within a 24-hour window. Either the network had been burned through operational security procedures, or someone had warned the handler. The investigative team went very quiet for 48 hours. What they did not do was move on the clerk. Because moving on the clerk at that moment, before they had identified the handler, would have ended the investigation with one arrest and a network that simply rebuilt itself around a different insider, a different cloud account, a different set of files. Counterintelligence does not win by arresting the person holding the rope. It wins by finding who is pulling it. The decision to hold was not easy. The clerk had access, present tense access, to movement data covering 4,200 active duty personnel across 19 deployments. Every day the operation continued without an arrest was another day that data was potentially available. The clock was running. 41 nights. That was how many times the clerk had entered that building in the dark. 8 encrypted transfers logged in the cloud account. And somewhere on the other end of those transfers, a foreign intelligence service had a picture of U.S. naval personnel movements that the sailors' own families did not have. What changed the operation was not a technical breakthrough. It was a human one. In the 10th week of Pale Eladeger, NCIS analysts reviewing the clerk's financial records identified a series of cash deposits. 14 separate deposits across 11 months, each between $3,000 and $6,000, each made at a different branch of a different bank, each just below the federal reporting threshold. Total value: $51,000 in cash deposits against a salary of $71,000 annually. The deposits were not on their own sufficient for prosecution. Structuring violations require proof of intent to evade reporting, and the amounts were defensible as personal savings practices by someone with a cautious financial personality. But they gave the investigation a new thread to pull. The analysts mapped the deposit dates against the cloud upload events. 11 of the 14 deposits fell within 72 hours of an upload. The correlation was not proof, but it was a rhythm. And rhythms, in counterintelligence, are how you find the conductor. Put yourself in the position of the lead FBI case agent at that moment. You have a subject making cash deposits that correlate with data transfers. You have an encrypted cloud account that has gone dark. You have a Title III wiretap producing nothing useful. You have active personnel data still sitting in that subject's reach. And you have no extraditable target on the other end of the network. Because the handler, by every indicator the NSA assessment could produce, was operating from outside U.S. jurisdiction. What you do not have is time. Because the data that has already moved is already being used. The GRU, Russia's Military Intelligence Directorate, did not need a perfect exfiltration program. They needed one thing: to know where U.S. naval personnel were going before they got there. Rotation schedules, berthing manifests, transfer orders. That is the currency of military intelligence at the operational level, not weapon specifications, not classified communications, movement. Who is going where and when. The most surprising part of Operation Pale Eladeger, and this is genuinely the detail that does not fit the expected picture, is that the compromise was not about what the clerk could access at the highest level. This was not a cleared official with a top-secret/SCI compartment walking out with nuclear posture documents. This was a GS7 records clerk with routine administrative access to personnel logistics. The handler had not recruited the person with the most access. They had recruited the person with the most overlooked access, and they had gotten 14 months out of it before a single person noticed. That is not a failure of the intelligence community's top tier. That is a failure of the assumption that low-level access is low-risk access. The wiretap produced its first significant result in the 12th week, not from the clerk's personal phone, but from a device associated with a secondary subject identified through the financial analysis. A brief encrypted message was intercepted through a domestic relay point, partially decoded by NSA-CI. The content was not fully legible, but 2 elements were: a reference to a next package and a date. The date was 6 weeks away. The operation had a hard deadline. If a 9th transfer occurred, more personnel data would move. If the team moved too early, without identifying the full network, they would catch one person and lose the rest. The FBI requested a 42-day window from the Department of Justice's National Security Division. They got it, along with authority to expand the wiretap to 3 additional devices. The next 6 weeks were the most operationally demanding period of Pale Eladeger. 3 FBI field offices coordinating in parallel, NCIS provided subject matter expertise on the naval logistics database. NSA, CI maintained passive technical collection on the network infrastructure. The lead case agents team conducted physical surveillance on the Clerk. Mobile surveillance, which in counterintelligence means rotating teams, different vehicles, different cover patterns every day, because the Clerk's behavior showed surveillance awareness that came from somewhere. On 3 separate occasions during the surveillance period, the Clerk made what experienced CI officers call a dry cleaning route, a series of apparently random errands, direction changes, and doubling back movements that would expose any fixed surveillance team following in sequence. The FBI adapted. They ran loose surveillance. Wider coverage area, more units, less proximity. At the cost of some granular detail. What they kept was the pattern. The Clerk met, on 2 separate occasions during the 6-week window, with a man identified through vehicle registration as a foreign national on a long-term business visa. A status that, by itself, means nothing, since millions of foreign nationals live and work legally in the United States. What made this contact significant was what the NSA CI assessment had already identified. The man's phone number appeared in the metadata of the network infrastructure that had hosted the download activity, not in the content of any communication. In the infrastructure. He was not the handler. He was the cutout, the intermediary, the human layer between the Clerk and whoever was pulling the files from abroad. The FBI now had 3 subjects, 1 inside a naval facility, 1 in a domestic contact role, and 1, the handler, unreachable, outside U.S. jurisdiction, almost certainly sitting in Moscow. What's most surprising about this configuration is not its sophistication, it's its economy. 3 nodes, 1 dead drop mechanism, payments in cash, small enough to be dismissed as savings. The GRU had built a collection network inside a U.S. naval command for what the financial reconstruction would eventually calculate as approximately $51,000 in total payments to the primary subject. What those payments purchased was personnel movement data covering 4,200 service members across 19 separate deployments, $51,000. 4,200 personnel, 19 deployments. That disproportion is the whole story. The decision to move came in the 17th week of Pale Elidur. The intelligence assessment from NSA CI indicated that the next scheduled upload window, the one referenced in the intercepted message, was 48 hours away. If the team waited for the upload to occur, they would have a 9th encrypted transfer on the cloud account as evidence. But they would also have more compromised data in GRU hands. If they moved before the upload, they would cut the network before the next transfer. The lead case agent recommended moving before. The National Security Division concurred. The operation was set for the following morning. Simultaneous arrests at 4 locations: the Naval Logistics Command Facility, the Clerk's residential address, the cutout's registered address, and a 4th location. A storage unit leased under a business name, identified through the expanded wiretap as a materials cache. There is a line in the operational plan that reads almost like a procedural formality, but represents 6 months of work, all subjects to be taken without prior notification. No internal facility advisories. Badge access door to be secured by FBI technical team at 0547 hours prior to subject's anticipated arrival. The Clerk typically arrived at the facility at 0612 hours on workdays. The FBI was going to be there first. It was a Tuesday in November 2024. At 0531 hours, 4 separate FBI tactical teams and 2 NCIS agent pairs received simultaneous execute orders. The operation had 11 minutes as its target window. 11 minutes from first breach to all subjects secured to minimize the risk of any alert reaching the network before the arrests were complete. 0531. Execute. At the Naval Logistics Command, the FBI technical team had pre-positioned at the badge access door during the night shift transition. At 0533, they secured the door on the Clerk's primary entrance route and established a containment perimeter across the 3 parking area approaches. The Clerk arrived at 0608, 14 minutes early. An anomaly that the surveillance team, running mobile coverage on the approach route, caught in time. The case agent was notified. The perimeter held. The Clerk's vehicle entered the facility parking area at 0609, pulled into a space, remained stationary for 2 minutes and 40 seconds, longer than usual. The surveillance team noted the delay. At 0612, the Clerk exited the vehicle. At 0613, 2 FBI agents in plain clothes made contact at the parking area. The Clerk was taken into custody without resistance. Handcuffs at 061342, according to the arrest log. Simultaneously, at 0613, a second team executed a dynamic entry at the clerk's residential address. The residence was unoccupied, consistent with the subject's presence at the facility, and the team began a court-authorized search. They located and seized one encrypted laptop and a secondary device under the bed frame within the first 8 minutes. At 0614, the team at the cutout's address executed their approach. The cutout was present, was taken into custody at 0616 after a brief attempt to access a phone. The phone was seized. At 0619, the storage unit location was breached. Inside, one additional laptop, one external server unit, and a collection of printed documents, including what appeared to be annotated pages from personnel rosters. Physical copies made from the digital records. 11 targets. 4 locations. 41 minutes from the first execute order to the last subject secured, running longer than planned because of a secondary subject identified at the cutout's location who had not appeared in prior surveillance. A third individual whose connection to the network had not been fully mapped. That individual became the 4th arrest of the morning. Subject number 4. The handler remained in Moscow. The indictments came down across 2 tranches. The primary subject, the records clerk, faced charges under 18 U.S.C. 794, gathering and transmitting national defense information to a foreign government, the most serious espionage statute in the U.S. Code. The potential penalty under Section 794 is life imprisonment. Additional charges included unauthorized computer access under 18 U.S.C. 1030 and conspiracy. The cutout faced charges under 18 U.S.C. 951, acting as an unregistered agent of a foreign government, along with conspiracy to commit espionage. The 3rd and 4th subjects faced conspiracy charges. 7 additional individuals identified through the expanded wiretap and financial reconstruction faced charges ranging from structuring violations to accessory counts. 11 indictments in total, 3 laptops, 2 servers, 14 months of falsified zero correction logs, 8 encrypted transfers, 2 agencies, 11 indicted. The handler, named in the indictment as a foreign national believed to be operating under GRU direction, was indicted in absentia. No extradition request was filed, not because DOJ lacked the will, but because Russia does not extradite its intelligence officers. That is not a legal technicality. It is a structural feature of how foreign adversary services operate. They recruit, they run, they collect. And when the network burns, they walk away, across a border that no federal warrant crosses. What strikes us about Operation Pale El Dedger is not the tradecraft, which, by the standards of foreign intelligence operations, was unremarkable. What strikes us is the math of the vulnerability. The clerk earned $71,000 a year in a position that required a security clearance, a background investigation, periodic reinvestigation, and compliance with a framework of access controls designed by some of the most security-conscious institutions in the world. All of that infrastructure, all of that protocol, and the actual point of failure was a cloud sync token nested inside a folder named payroll backup, and a number that had been sitting at 0 for 14 months in a column that nobody checked because nobody thought to check it. Here's what this tells us about insider threat management right now. The perimeter security model assumes the threat is trying to get in. The insider threat is already in, and the data that matters. In this case, not classified weapons specifications, not intelligence assessments, not diplomatic cables, is sometimes a rotation schedule, a birthing manifest. The answer to, where are they going and when? The GRU had that answer for 14 months. They had it before the sailors' families were notified of deployment dates. They had it because one person decided that $71,000 a year was not enough, or was not the right thing, or was not whatever it needed to be to hold against whatever the handler offered on the other end of that cloud account. We do not know which. The indictment does not say. And honestly, that question, what it actually takes to turn someone who has sworn an oath, passed a background review, and sits in an ordinary office doing ordinary work, that question does not have a clean answer. Would you have noticed the signs before the 14-month mark? Tell us in the comments. We read every one. If you would have missed the signal too, subscribe to Federal Casebook and tell us in the comments which thread you'd have pulled first. The zero correction column, the 3:40 a.m. access spike, or the cash deposits just under the reporting threshold. Comment Uditor if you'd have started with the database. Comment 340 if the access log is where you'd have gone. We'll read every answer. The network is gone. 11 people face federal charges. A GRU collection program that ran for 14 months inside a naval logistics command has been dismantled. But the system did not find it. An auditor noticed a number that had been sitting in a column, perfectly still, for 14 months. while 41 nights of access spikes moved the data of 4,200 personnel into foreign hands. The system processed that number every quarter and filed it. One person read it and asked why it was so quiet. That is the whole difference. 19 deployments, 8 encrypted transfers, $51,000 paid, 11 indicted, 4 locations hit simultaneously, 14 months of silence in a column that should have been noisy, 4,200 personnel whose movement was known to a foreign adversary before they left port, 1 auditor, 1 3-line note, 1.